Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third lecture in our members' lecture series for this year. And tonight the lecture is jointly sponsored with the American Institute of Archaeology. And I invite you to join the American Institute of Archaeology if you aren't now a member, and certainly to become a member of the Institute if you're not a member. The next lecture in our series will be on January the 24th, at which time Douglas Essie will, from the Oriental Institute, will speak on village life in 3rd millennium BC, new excavations at Tal Yakush in Israel. We'll all look forward to that lecture. And I'd also like to announce that tomorrow afternoon we are very pleased to have a lecture on Light in the Dark Ages, Evidence for Hittite Continuity by David Hawkins from the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London. That will be here at 4 p.m., and you're all, of course, invited. Now I come to the introduction of tonight's speaker, and it's one of those times when it's so easy because I know Matthew Stolper from our youth, and he's a person who is very easy to introduce. First, a few of the formalities. He took his BA at Harvard, his PhD at Michigan, where he studied under George Cameron, and wrote a dissertation on the Murashu archive, which became a book later entitled Entrepreneurs and Empire. He is not only an epigrapher and an Assyriologist, but he's a field archaeologist, and it's in this guise that I first came to know Matthew. We both did our first Near Eastern field archaeology together under Bob Dyson at Haji Firuz. And Matthew then came later and worked with us as epigrapher and as archaeologist at Malayan in southern Iran. And I can say that his field notes are always wonderfully accurate and full of information and detail. He's a very keen observer. And of course, every director wants field notes that have detail. So many directors find the field notes are just very sketchy indeed, and you hardly know whether the person was even there that day, much less what it was they actually found. Matthew's notes are always complete, but more than that, they're always a lot of fun. There's always a lot about the weather. There's always a lot about how he feels. There's always a lot about his doubts and his problems of conceptualizing what he's doing. This is all couched in very beautifully expressed phrases. Well, it's always a delight to read Matthew's field notes, and I wish I could say that my own field notes were anything like as good as his are. Since he's been here at Chicago, he's worked on the Assyrian dictionary. He's also worked on Elamite, worked on some of the texts from Persepolis. And I remember one morning walking into the laboratory at Malayan and finding Matthew still sitting at his table with his white lab coat, which had Doc embroidered across the pocket, his head down on his arms. And I said, what are you doing, Matthew? He looks up, bleary-eyed. He seems to have been there all night. And he says, I'm one of about a dozen people in the world who can't understand Elamite and care. In addition to this struggle with Elamite, he has published numerous papers and articles, mainly on late Babylonian text. And so it's with great pleasure that I introduce Matthew to you, who will speak tonight. Now I have a problem. I have to tell you the title, right? That's part of what I'm here for. I'm supposed to tell you what the title is. But you're not supposed to yell in a crowded auditorium. You're not supposed to do that. So I'm warning you, I'm not yelling. I'm just telling you that the title is Fire in Babylon, Fire in Syria, the Kasr text and the Achaemenid Babylonia. So, Matthew, welcome.
Thank you for that generous introduction. Some of it's true. In case you're wondering what the trick is, you get there a half an hour before the director and start taking a nap, and he thinks you've been there all night. Gets cold in an unheated building, so you better get there at 7 in the morning to open the vodka if you're going to work in a mud brick building all day long. I have good news and bad news. The bad news is that Elamite is not an order of insects. It's not a religious sect. It's not a mineral. And it's not the rear chain of the Dolomites. The good news is I'm not going to be talking about Elamite or anything to do with Elamite tonight. I hope that my rather obscure title, the title of my talk, that is, will become a little clearer in the course of the talk, but I should give you a couple of preliminary indications of what I think this talk is about. Could I have the lights out, please? Like most kinds of investigation, the study of the ancient Near East proceeds from the known to the unknown, and over the last 200 years or so, this chain of inquiry has made it possible to contemplate some very remote antiquity, which I exemplify here by a picture of Professor Sumner contemplating the remote antiquity of the 5th millennium BC from the almost as remote antiquity of about 1968. What I'm going to talk about tonight is an early link in that chain of inquiry, an episode that belongs simultaneously to the twilight of the history of the ancient Near East, of ancient Mesopotamia, but also to the dawn of the study of ancient Mesopotamia. In the summer of 401 BC, a disgruntled cadet of the Achaemenid royal house, Cyrus the Younger, led an army from western Anatolia to the neighborhood of Babylon in an effort to overthrow the king, his brother, Artaxerxes II. This is number 16, is supposed to be a coin portrait of Cyrus the Younger, and number 19 of his brother. The numismatist who prepared this volume thought that that must be a coin portrait of Cyrus the Younger because he doesn't have a beard, and Xenophon said that Cyrus doesn't have a beard. It's now universally agreed that this is not a coin portrait of Cyrus the Younger, but it's as close as I can come. The attempt to seize the throne was, as most of you know, an utter failure. Cyrus was killed in battle at Cunaxa on the outskirts of Babylon, and Artaxerxes reigned for another 42 years. The general rule of being an Achaemenid king was if you could get through the first 6 months, you were okay for about the next 40 years. The utter futility of this expedition, however, did absolutely nothing to dampen its celebrity, because Cyrus's army included a mercenary force of about 12,000 Greeks, known to history ever since as the 10,000. You'll notice that it is not only Assyrian historians and modern military procurement officers who are a little vague with military statistics. Some of these 12,000 were Greek thugs, flotsam of the Peloponnesian War and its aftermath, and at least one was a dropout from the school of Athens. You'll note here the elderly Professor Socrates and the sententious gesture that's typical of many faculty members, and the student here with the rather wandering expression indicating what is perhaps something less than utterly rapt interest. There he is, scoring his points. A dropout from the school of Athens who was looking for adventure and experience in what was even then already known as the real world. And here is the teacher, still with the same sententious expression, still making the same point, apparently oblivious to the fact that his student has gone home, changed clothes, and is now saying goodbye. His account of Cyrus's march up country, that is Xenophon's Anabasis, became the greatest story ever told to modern first-year students of Greek. notwithstanding the fact that most of it actually describes the catabasis, that is, the armed retreat back down country of after Cyrus's defeat, at the end of which the celebrated 10,000 numbered about 6,000. And here is another depiction of the first meeting between Xenophon and Cyrus, and at least according to this artist, this is, I believe, done by Alma Tadema. Unlike the numismatist, he doesn't care whether Cyrus has a beard or not. Long before the Anabasis became a standard text for modern students of Greek, you'll notice that there is a distinct tradition in modern portraits, many of them beardless. The Anabasis, long before that, had already been a standard reference in the ancient political debate, the debate that preceded the Macedonian invasion and eventual destruction of the Achaemenid Empire, which I symbolize here with the two known ancient portraits of Xenophon. Whether they're likenesses or not, I can't say, but they are ancient. Because this failed expedition and the successful retreat under arms of the Greek contingent were understood by people in Greece to expose the Persian Empire's vulnerability to attack. For some of the vainglorious orators of Greece in the 4th century, Cyrus's expedition seemed to mark the sunset of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Because of these Greeks, Cyrus's fiasco is the best-known episode in the history of the later Achaemenid Persian Empire, by which I mean the period between Xerxes and Alexander the Great, the last 3/4 of Achaemenid Persian history. But from the point of view of Near Eastern sources, and in particular from the point of view of Babylonian documents, this entire episode was a non-event. The overwhelming majority of known Babylonian texts from the time are legal and administrative documents, of which this is a reasonably representative example. There are about 1,200 published texts of these kinds from the 155 years between the accession of Xerxes in 486 BC and the arrival of Alexander in 331, and I know of 400 or 500 more unpublished ones. Of all of these, almost 2/3 come from a single source, the Murashu Archive of Nippur, a group of business records covering the last half of the 5th century BC. This text comes from that archive. As a result, our view of late Achaemenid Babylonia is seriously skewed by the perspective of a single source. It's very nice to say there are 1,000 or more tablets, but when 2/3 of them come from one point of view, it doesn't really do you a lot of good. What's more to the immediate point, these contracts and memoranda, legal and administrative documents, are extremely conservative in form and parochial in content. Their authors were simply not immediately interested in the ambitions of Achaemenid princes, but only in the getting and spending of their Babylonian subjects. Even in the stirring times around 401 BC, when Cyrus was marching around the Near East making trouble, these tablets seem to record business as usual. Although I hasten to point out this charming seal impression on one of the Murashu tablets showing a warrior in Iranian garb beating up on a kneeling captive in what appears to be Greek hoplite armor. A nice bit of local chauvinism. The invasion of the army of Cyrus the Younger, the mobilization, quartering, provisioning of the immense defending army gathered at Babylon, the armed retreat of the defeated contingent, undoubtedly put immense short-term strains on Babylonian resources, and they must have affected the availability of goods and the behaviors of economic men, yet they left no immediately discernible direct mark in any known Babylonian text. There is, however, an indirect reflection, not of the invasion, or of the battle, or of Cyrus's death, or of the retreat of the 10,000, or even of the inevitable costs of these events to Babylonian bystanders, but of a single incident, seemingly a minor incident along the way. When Cyrus's army was crossing northern Syria on the way from the Gulf of Iskenderun to the Euphrates crossing at Thapsacus, that is, along this route. They paused somewhere in the vicinity of Aleppo. There, says Xenophon, was the palace of a man called Belesys, who had been governor of Assyria. Here it is, charmingly captioned. You see how important this episode was in the eyes of the editors. It's embedded in a paragraph captioned "Fish Worship." And here is the reference to Belesys, the palace, Basileia of Belesys, who had been the governor of Syria. And attached to the palace, says Xenophon, was a large and beautiful park. The Greek word comes from the Persian word, paradise. Cyrus had his army destroy the park, cut down the trees, and burn the palace to the ground. Here's an effort to locate the palace somewhere in the vicinity of Aintab up here. Strictly guesswork. This act of incendiary vandalism, burning down the palace of the governor, is the fire in Syria of my title. It is also a puzzling act coming from a man who would be king and who needed allies, especially allies among the class of people who governed the empire that he was trying to control. If it were not for this petty atrocity, Greek history would know nothing of this satrap, Belesys. The unknown editor of the addendum to Xenophon's Anabasis in Book 7 lists this governor Belesys as one of the governors of Persian territories. Where are we? That's about as good as it's going to get. As one of the governors of Persian territories at the time of Cyrus's expedition. The modern editors of this edition of the Anabasis followed this addendum's straightforward understanding of the text, and since one of the editors of this edition is the founding president of this university, William Rainey Harper, I'm obliged to take this opinion seriously. Other modern scholars, considering the addendum to be not only spurious but also confused, conclude from Xenophon's own use of a past participle that Belesys had been a governor of the past, but nevertheless of the recent Achaemenid Persian past. At least a few scholars supposed that they could recognize this same man, Belesys, in a Babylonian text, in fact, in one of the very first Babylonian tablets published in modern times. The tablet had been copied by Carl Bellino sometime between 1815 and 1817, and this is Bellino's copy. It is a superb copy. There is nothing that can be done to correct it now, and that is remarkable because it was done long before the cuneiform script could be read and understood. After Bellino's death, in 1820, the copy was published by Georg Grotefend, one of the pioneers of the decipherment of the cuneiform script. The year of publication was 1837, and I should point out that this 20-year gap between the preparation of the copy and the publication of the copy set a standard and tradition that is still commonly honored by scholars of cuneiform. Although Grotefend had already made his breakthroughs in the decipherment of Old Persian cuneiform, he still was unable to read the Babylonian text. In 1893, Father Johann Nepomuk Strassmayer, depicted here, published a new copy of the text that was actually a considerably inferior copy, inferior to Bellino's, but by this time it seemed to matter little because Babylonian cuneiform had been deciphered, the text could be read, and it could be understood. And this is the original. It is, once it's understood, a little disappointing. It is a routine legal document, the record of an overdue debt of barley. But the barley was dispersed by a person who is called the servant of Baal-Shunu, governor of across the river. This Babylonian term, across the river, in Babylonian it's Ebir Nari, since the 8th century BC had been used to label the territories west of the Euphrates, that is Syria and Palestine. This tablet is dated in the 3rd year of a king Artaxerxes, and the problem for a long time was under which of the 3 kings named Artaxerxes did this governor of Syria, Baal-Shunu, serve? Historians were divided between assigning it to King Artaxerxes I, hence to 461 BC, in which case this Baal-Shunu could have absolutely nothing to do with Xenophon's governor Bellicis, and assigning it to the reign of Artaxerxes II, hence to 401 BC, a mere matter of months before Cyrus the Younger marched through Syria and destroyed the palace of Bellicis. In fact, this issue, not so hotly debated, but debated nevertheless, had already been settled by another of the very first published Babylonian tablets, here again copied by Bellino and also published only after his death by Grotofen, this time in 1839. And although it was published in 1839, it was virtually forgotten until 1976. In fact, the tablet itself has been lost, so Bellino's copy and a photograph of the tablet that was published in 1892 are the only surviving records of it. This text is an apprenticeship contract, and it is again initiated by a man entitled Servant of Baal-Shunu, governor of across the river, that is of Syria, son of Baal-Utsurshu, and it was drafted at Babylon and dated in the 17th year of King Darius. Now, at this point, simple economy of assumptions takes over, requiring that both of these texts refer to the same governor of Syria, that the kings in question are therefore Darius II and Artaxerxes II, that this Baal-Shunu was therefore governor in Syria across the river at least as early as 407 BC and at least as late as 401 BC, just before Cyrus the Younger went marching through Syria like Sherman through Georgia, burning down his palace as if it were Tara in Gone with the Wind. All that being so, the identification of this man, Baal-Shunu, governor of across the river, with the man whom Xenophon calls Bellicis, governor of Syria, is beyond serious question. We have now a date for the governor, the Babylonian form of his name, the Babylonian form of his father's name, the Babylonian form of his title, and despite the usually intractable character of Babylonian legal texts, we have another fragile link between the great tradition of Western history, founded on the classics of Greece and Rome, and the equally great tradition of the ancient Near East. This was one of the cracks in the wall that led from the known of ancient history to the unknown of the ancient Near East, as it was in the early 19th century. What is less immediately remarkable, but ultimately more important, is the fact that this same man, this same governor Baal-Shunu, reappears in some other Babylonian texts. In particular, there are three very fragmentary texts in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in East Berlin, published in 1972, but without facsimile, so I'm afraid I can't show you illustrations of them. Those three texts in turn belong to a group of several hundred damaged tablets that were actually excavated at Babylon in 1913 by the German team that was then directed by Robert Koldewey, and instead of showing you the tablets, I show you Robert Koldewey in this marvelous conveyance that I think should be the envy of any modern archaeologist. These three texts are also legal texts, and all three of them again mention a man called Baal-Shunu, the son of Baal-Utsurshu, but here he is not entitled governor of across the river, but governor of Babylon. And they are firmly dated to the reign of Darius II, to the years between 417 and 415 BC. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's true, every Tom, Dick, and Harry in Babylonia was called Baal-Shunu or Baal-Utsurshu. But the fact is that the combination of those two names as a given name and patronym is not at all common. In fact, all the late Babylonian texts in which this combination of name and patronym occur refer to the same individuals. I'll spare you the grim prosopographic argument and confess that the strength of the pieces of evidence vary, but the combined effect of the evidence is clear and strong, and the result is a dossier that so far includes 35 texts and fragments that mention this same man, Baal-Shunu, the son of Baal-Utsurshu, 15 more texts that mention men identified elsewhere as the agents and subordinates of this Baal-Shunu. And here are some more of Bellino's copies of some of those texts. The individual documents themselves are generally dull, apart from occasional specifics that are of absorbing interest to cuneiform philologists and legal historians, but the whole dossier has an utterly unparalleled historical yield. It affords a rough curriculum for a career officer in the Achaemenid political service. Being unable to illustrate the man himself, I'll show you the stages in the life of the excavator, Robert Koldewey. Here deep in thought at Babylon, and here a little blitzed out by the results of his work. On the evidence of these documents, this man Baal-Shunu, the son of Baal-Utsurshu, had been the principal of a diversified Babylonian business operation. He maintained his interests in the business while he also served in the Achaemenid Persian provincial administration. He was active in the business at least as early as 425 and at least as late as 400 BC, that is, for a good 25 years. He was a governor of Babylon for at least 7 years between 421 and 414, and he was a governor of Syria for at least another 7 years between 407 and 401. Judging by his name and his father's name, he was a Babylonian, but he was active in a political arena that was normally dominated by Iranian aristocrats. And by that I mean by a class of influential people who belonged to the nation that had conquered the Persian Empire and that still ruled it. Men and women who were closely tied to the ruling house by blood or by marriage, men and women who were close enough to the king to have claims on his kinship or else on his fear. This Babylonian, Baal-Shunu, was clearly himself a political adept, for he weathered not only the troubled succession of King Darius II in 424 BC, but the troubled accession of King Artaxerxes II in 403, and even the the invasion and failure of Cyrus the Younger, the firebug who torched his palace, in 401 BC. Now, this dossier on Baal-Shunu is not a modern artifact. In the words of Anna Russell, I'm not making this up, folks. What I mean by that is the documents that record the business dealings of Baal-Shunu and his subordinates fit together as parts of a single ancient business archive. The group of texts is itself an ancient artifact that is, in fact, itself actually part of a considerably larger group of texts. The 3 texts I mentioned that are now in Berlin, that call Baal-Shunu governor of Babylon, belong, as I said, to a group of several hundred tablets and fragments excavated at Babylon in 1913. More specifically, they came from a mound traditionally called the Kassr, that is, the fortress, here in the central part of the complex at Babylon. And within that area, specifically from the area that, let's see, here is the Kassr again in Koldewey's plan, somewhere on here there's a date, 1903. The area we're concerned with was still unexcavated in 1903, right here. And it's a part of the Kassr mound called the Hauptburg. And here is Koldewey's plan with his one-sentence description of where he found tablets in these squares, that is, this area in here. The various sketchy excavation reports stress that these excavated tablets and fragments had some distinctive physical characteristics, and since I can't show you pictures of the excavated pieces, I will ask you to bear in your minds for a few moments these physical characteristics. Most of the tablets, not surprisingly, are very badly broken. Most of them are severely burned, in fact, usually burned to the point of being vitrified, especially on one face, but often well preserved on the other, as if they had been lying flat on wooden shelves that had burned. Some of the tablets have Aramaic epigraphs incised on them, often quite difficult to interpret. Many of them are fragments of sales documents impressed with scribal seals of a type that's well known from the reign of Artaxerxes I and earlier. And the seal impressions on texts of other types have not only the Babylonian and Iranian motifs that are commonly found on Babylonian legal texts of this period, but also what is somewhat more exceptional, impressions of seals with Greek style and motifs. All of the other texts that mention Baal-Shunu, the unexcavated texts that do not come from the German excavations but are now housed in the British Museum, the Louvre, the Yale Babylonian Collection, and elsewhere, have just the same characteristics. They're fire damaged, commonly vitrified on one face. And when I say fire damage, I'm not kidding. What's left here is the date. They sometimes have, this is a text in the British Museum. They sometimes have Aramaic epigraphs. Here's another fire damage text now in Oxford. And here is the reverse, showing an Aramaic epigraph incised on it. And they sometimes have seal impressions in a style that I believe to be more Hellenic than it is Babylonian and Assyrian. Here's a lovely seated woman playing a harp. Here's a sketch of the seal. This is also on a tablet that's now in Oxford. Now, none of these physical or formal properties is unique to this group of texts, but taken together they corroborate links that can be found among common personal names, common seal impressions, and common contextual features to indicate that the scattered documents that record Baal-Shunu's business came from a single ancient group, the same group as the texts that were excavated in Babylon on the Kasr. And exactly the same kind of evidence makes it possible to attribute still other scattered texts, documents that do not mention Baal-Shunu or his subordinates, to the same group. Here, for instance, is the Greek seal impression, Greek-style seal impression, or at least that's what I consider it to be, on a text that's now in the small tablet collection at the Kelsey Museum in Ann Arbor. Here's another on another text in the same collection, and this seal impression reappears on one of the excavated tablets in Berlin. Here are some rather paltry sketches of those two, in case the photos are not too clear. This sort of depiction of naked people holding spears is not at all Babylonian in my experience. Here's a text from the Yale collection with another one of these unusual seal impressions on it. And here's a text that's in the collection of the Oriental Institute in Leningrad. In fact, this is the entire collection of the Oriental Institute at Leningrad. And as you can see, there is a fragment of a similar sort of seal impression on it. And here another one in the British Museum. This is, as you may have guessed by now, the fire in Babylon of my title, the fire that caused this. It is not a documented political gesture like Cyrus's arson in Syria, but an anonymous event from an uncertain time and place that left a conspicuous mark on this set of documents and made it possible to recognize some of the links among them. I have called this scattering of tablets the Kassr archive, after the known provenience of the excavated pieces, but I now think this term is a little inaccurate. The texts are indeed from the Kasr at Babylon, but there is actually some reason to believe that they include the remains of 2 or more ancient archives that were once stored together. I've so far identified about 110 tablets and fragments that certainly or probably came from this group, and in these days they are scattered among Berlin, London, Oxford, Paris, Cannes, Leningrad, New Haven, Philadelphia, and Ann Arbor that I know of, and possibly in other collections. As you can see, if one has a mind to write a travel grant, this provides a remarkable opportunity. There are also a few tablets that are lost, as I have mentioned, but documented only by old copies. And I show you here this and this copy. Both of these come from the unpublished papers of Georg Grotefend, whose picture I showed you earlier. Grotefend's Nachlass now in the library in Göttingen. And these are two copies of a tablet that is mentioned in the literature as early as 1802, but it has long since disappeared. How did these tablets come to be so widely scattered in time and space? The texts themselves are records of the history of ancient businessmen acting in an ancient empire, but the scattering of the texts in time and space is a reflection of the modern European exploration of the Middle East, and that in turn is a product of the history of modern European empires. I am going to be talking not entirely about the Achaemenid Empire, but also about the British Empire. I have mentioned that several of the Kassr texts were copied by Carl Bellino, and copied with astonishing accuracy, considering that he could not read the script that he was copying. Between 1815 and his death in 1820, Carl Bellino was the secretary of Claudius Rich. and Rich was the British East India Company's resident in Baghdad. Rich had arrived in Baghdad in 1807 when the Peace of Tilsit between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander seemed to put the infant British Empire in India at risk. The text that Bellino copied belonged to Rich and to his medical officer and political assistant, a man named John Hine, and to some other remarkable people in Baghdad with antiquarian interests. The enduring monument of Rich's own antiquarian activity is his publication, specifically two memoirs, one called Memoir on the Ruins of Babylon, describing an extended visit to the site in 1811, and this is the map from his survey of the site on that visit. The second memoir, called, oddly enough, Second Memoir on Babylon, published after a revisit to the site in 1817. In his narrative of his first visit to Babylon, Rich remarks on villagers who had quarried ancient bricks from the massive exposed ruins on the Kassr mound. This is Rich's sketch of those ruins. And a similar view by another 19th century visitor. And Rich says that he himself found baked cuneiform tablets at the base of the Kassr. At least some of these texts are a part of the group that I've called the Kassr Archive, as this text, with the impression of one of the scribal seals that I mentioned earlier, confirms, as this text confirms. In 1969, an article on scribal seal impressions from fragments excavated at the Kassr by the Koldovy team in 1913 included this illustration of an impression that recurs on at least 30 pieces from the Kassr. It is, as you see, the same impression that Bellino copied from a text belonging to Rich and John Hine, and it occurs on still other texts, such as this one in the Louvre. This is last year's photo. This is 1969. This is about 1815. The dispersal of these Kassr texts, as it now seems, went on for over 100 years. Even before 1811, when Rich visited the site, villagers had been baked bricks and had exposed some of the burned texts. Rich and his associates collected a number of the texts during their visit, and most of these were eventually donated to the British Museum. Here's a copy of one in the British Museum. Where some of them were again misplaced. Here's one that found its way into the Kuyunjik collection instead of the other BM collections. Other early visitors to the site, exemplified here by a plan of the site done by Sir Robert Kerr Porter, who arrived in 1817 when Rich was still there, probably collected more of the texts, and these were subsequently dispersed among various museums and private collections. Here's another early traveler to the text, a gentleman named, as the caption says, Tinko Martinus Liklama Chevalier a Nijholt, a Frisian gentleman traveler who spent 3 days at Babylon and did a little illicit excavation in the 1860s, and whose collection is now in the Municipal Museum in Cannes. I only wish he had found 1,000 tablets so that I could go there to look at them. The commercial trade in antiquities that began to flourish rather disastrously in Mesopotamia during the 1870s almost certainly scattered more texts from the Kassr, because by 1870 it was a proven source of tablets. And in 1913, the German team excavated not the archive, but what was left of the archive. And when they were excavating, they were working on a site that was long since riddled with the pits and gullies of earlier excavators and visitors. Koldovy himself stayed at Babylon until 1917, when he left only a few steps ahead of the final advance of the British Army in the Mesopotamian campaign of the First World War. He left the Kassr texts behind in the expedition quarters, And eventually the British Mandate government after the war enacted a new antiquities law to cover excavations and finds from excavations, and the finds were divided and sent on to the Berlin Museum, where they arrived in 1926. However, by that time, between 1917 and 1926, it's fairly clear that some of the tablets had already been taken from the dig house and distributed by the antiquities trade, and I'm reasonably sure that the texts in Ann Arbor and the texts in Yale arrived by that route. Now, details of the kind that I've illustrated make it possible to reconstitute at least a part of the original ancient text group, but you may be asking the question that arises from this activity of reconstituting the group: why? That is, what is the value of this enterprise? There is obviously some pleasure, and I hope there is even some virtue, in restoring an ancient artifact, that is, the archive itself, an artifact that was destroyed by the processes of recovery. This is not merely the pleasure of fitting together the pieces of an antiquarian jigsaw puzzle or detective story, but it's a matter of actually recreating both the context and the character of the artifact itself, and so reviving its utility as a historical fact, putting it back together so one can see its shape and relocating it within the site of Babylon. What's more, as I've mentioned, about 2/3 of the currently known texts from later Achaemenid Babylonia come from the Murashu archive of Nippur, here in about the center of Babylonia. The 110 or so Kassr fragments that I've identified so far now constitute the second largest single source from the period. They're partially contemporary with the Murashu texts. They record similar but not identical kinds of business conducted under similar general conditions of social organization and economics, but they come from a different city, from Babylon itself and its environs, that is about 50 miles away. As it happens, there are surprisingly specific connections between the Kassr texts from Babylon and the Murashu texts from Nippur, connections that reflect, I think, the working environment of the time. Here, for example, is a drawing of the rather unusual seal impression of a witness to one of the Murashu texts. These peculiar winged lions with sort of kitty-like heads and bizarre headgear, resting on lions that I'm told they're lions, but they look more like hedgehogs to me. Quite a distinctive seal. Here is the seal impression from one of the Kasr texts. This time it belongs not to a witness, but to a man who sold some real estate to Baal-Shunu, the governor. And you can see here the figure inside the disc, the winged lions with the kitty cat-like heads, a little bit of the headgear. Here are these hedgehog-like lions. Here is a sketch of the one on that tablet. Both of these seal impressions are labeled with captions that give the owner's name and patronym. Both are impressions of the same seal. Both are captioned with the same name and patronym. There's no question about the identity. This is one of several such personal connections between the two archives, and what I think it means is just this. The businesses recorded in these two archives, despite the 50 miles between them, shared not only the same social, economic, and political milieu at a general level, but they actually had some common clientele. These were men of property who moved easily among cities, who actually had face-to-face acquaintance with each other, and whose getting and spending tied the various districts of Babylonia, for good or ill, into a common framework. They formed a kind of commercial elite, although not a terribly small one, and one of the members of it was Baal-Shunu, a businessman and governor, and his connection, both with the business and with the provincial administration, tied that commercial framework to the actual apparatus of provincial administration. In fact, the Kassr texts come not just from the capital of the province, Babylon, but from the very political center of the capital, that is, the Hauptburg on the Kassr Mound, an area that was a sort of acropolis in Achaemenid times, the site of a palace and a group of public buildings. The association between these public buildings and the Kassr tablets is unfortunately beyond archaeological recovery, because the site was hopelessly disturbed long before Koldovig got there. Still, the find spot on the Kassr at least hints that there were ties between the firm that compiled parts of the archive and the agencies of provincial government, and the fact that one of the principals of the business, Beilshunu, was himself a member of the Achaemenid Political Administrative Service appears to confirm that connection. Consequently, although the Kasr texts are legal records of ostensibly private, mundane business dealings, they supply at least indirect information on Achaemenid provincial organization and therefore on imperial policies. And that brings me back to attempting to interpret the career of Beilshunu. The Kasr texts call Beilshunu first governor of Babylon and later governor of across the river, that is, of Syria. But the implications of those titles are not, I am afraid, perfectly obvious, and to explain that, I must look back to the beginnings of the Achaemenid Empire. In those Achaemenid good old days, 539 BC, when Cyrus the Great, not Cyrus the Younger, actually succeeded where his younger namesake failed, succeeded in conquering Babylonia, he got hold not only of the biggest and richest state of Western Asia, Babylonia itself, but also of its tributary empire, reaching across the river over Syria and Palestine to the Arabian oases and the border of Egypt. All of that. Within 5 years of the conquest, Babylonian legal texts begin to mention a satrap, a man with the Iranian name Gobrias, and the title governor of Babylon and across the river. Its administrative domain was coterminous, at least in name, with the conquered Babylonian Empire. This man stayed on as satrap of the combined province for at least 10 years and probably longer, and in the early years of the king Darius the Great, 3 more Babylonian texts mention another governor, again with an Iranian name, and still entitled governor of Babylon and across the river of the combined province until 516 BC. Until recently, that was the last known mention of the title. But in the latest issue of the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, that is the journal of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at this university, and just as our director urges you to become members of its institute, I urge you to become subscribers to that journal. In the latest issue of that journal, there is published a document that extends the historical life of this enormous province by fully another 30 years. There again appears to have an Iranian name and patronym, by the way. Now, it's generally agreed that Cyrus the Great brought into existence an enormous administrative unit, the combined province of Babylon, Babylonia, and Syria, or rather that he recognized the political integrity of the Babylonian Empire that he'd conquered, but simply reduced it to the status of an enormous province. The western part of this province, called across the river, was at first only an administrative subdivision of the larger province, and its governor was subordinate to the satrap of the combined province. At some later time, the 2 areas across the river, Syria, Palestine, and Babylonia, were separated, made into distinct provinces with equivalent political status, and so later texts mention distinct individuals entitled either governor of Babylon or governor of across the river, but not both. The question is the date and political occasion on which these 2 provinces were separated, and that question is once again open. It is now clear that the separation took place only sometime after the reign of Darius I, and not, for example, as part of an imperial reorganization after Darius's own troubled rise to power. It is also clear that the combined province of Babylonia and Syria was not just a short-term arrangement, that is, not just a convenient acceptance of the status quo at a time of rapid conquest when the conquerors really couldn't do much to change the way things were run anyway. This province lasted for at least 50 years and under at least 3 governors, and during just the times when the imperial systems of control were being developed and installed, tested by rebellion, and overhauled. Over 50 years of joint administration, the interdependence of these 2 areas, Syria and Babylonia, can only have grown closer under imperial auspices. So when some of the Kasr texts call Beilshunu governor of Babylon or governor of across the river, the political implications of these titles are a little less plain than they may seem. So, I'm afraid, are the titles themselves, because the Babylonian terms for governor, Pichatu or Baal Pichati, like their Aramaic counterpart Pecha, or their Iranian counterpart, the word that we know as satrap, and their various Greek counterparts, archon, hyparch, and so on. All of these terms are equivocal in the matter of rank. All of them can label provincial governors of high rank and wide competence, but all of them can also label district officials and sub-governors. And that is Belshanu certainly was in his capacity as governor of Babylon. He was a district governor, not a satrap in the conventional term. For texts from the Murashu archive mention a man with an Iranian name, Gobrias, who is also called governor of Babylon, just like Belshanu. But unlike Belshanu, he is also called governor of the land of Akkad, a form of the title that makes it absolutely clear that he was the provincial governor of Babylonia. And the texts that mention this man overlap the texts that call Belshanu governor of Babylon by about 4 years. So it appears that the provincial governorship of Babylonia, like the earlier governorship of Babylon and across the river, and like the governorships of all of the other major provinces of the Achaemenid Empire, was ordinarily assigned to Iranians of high social and political rank, men who presumably held or claimed general authority to execute imperial policy. But the district sub-governorships, the governorship of Babylon, such sub-governorships were assigned to Babylonians, presumably men who were competent to translate imperial policy into familiar forms of familiar Babylonian ways of doing things, Babylonian ways of control and extraction, which I symbolize with the Babylonian tribute bearers from the Persepolis reliefs. Who better than a man like Belshanu, an established member of the commercial elite of the country, to translate policy into control of a familiar sort? Belshanu is not the only documented example of this lower level of administrators, but he is certainly now the best documented example. It is conceivable that Belsis, or Belshanu, was later in Syria what he had been earlier in Babylonia, that is, a district official subordinate to a provincial governor. Both Xenophon and the Babylonian texts, though, call Belshanu, Belsis, governor of Syria, rather than calling him, for instance, governor of Aleppo. And the most straightforward interpretation of this title is the one that is chosen by the author of the editorial addendum to the Anabasis, namely that Belsis, Belshanu, was himself the provincial governor. In that case, his transfer from Babylonia was a truly extraordinary promotion through the ranks, the elevation of a Babylonian businessman to a rank normally taken by Iranian aristocrats. And even if it was not a promotion, even if it was a transfer to a position of similar rank, it was an extraordinary event in the recorded annals of Achaemenid history. It was King Darius II, Darius Ochus, who transferred Belshanu to this satrapy sometime between 414 and 407 BC. And this transfer or promotion, whichever it was, may have been nothing more than a reward for services rendered during the succession crisis that brought Darius II to the throne. Babylonia itself had been the base and the staging area for Darius's faction during the crisis, and Belshanu, who was, after all, a prominent member of the business community in Babylon, must have been at least compliant in the struggle, and he may have been helpful enough to Ochus to actually have a claim on the new king's gratitude. That is a plausible view of events, but it is also possible that there's a little more to the matter, because Darius was never the heir apparent to the throne. He was recognized in his own time as a usurper, and Greek historians of later years even gave him the sobriquet Nothos, that is, the bastard. His rise to power had actually split the imperial aristocracy into factions, and for years after his accession, he faced serious opposition from some of his cousins. Syria was a special problem. These troubles may have been the background of Belshanu's own remarkable career. I would speculate, without being able to prove it, that Belshanu's transfer by Darius to the governor of Syria was perhaps the deliberate creation of a homo novus, meant perhaps to put a province with a recent history of political resistance to the usurper, a province where restraints on the power of the local aristocratic families had proved inadequate, to put that province into the hands of a man who was politically safe precisely because he was not an Iranian aristocrat, but a mere Babylonian, a man without claims of blood or kinship on the throne, and therefore socially incapable of dangerous political ambition. From the king's point of view, and from Baal-Shunu's, the results of this appointment were eminently satisfactory, for Baal-Shunu was still in office when Darius died, when his son Artaxerxes took the throne, and when Cyrus the Younger publicized his dissatisfaction with this Babylonian upstart, a sort of class enemy to the disaffected aristocrats whom Cyrus needed to win over if he was to control the empire, when Cyrus demonstrated his dissatisfaction by burning down the governor's palace. Whether or not these were the motives for Baal-Shunu's transfer, and they are, of course, a matter of my speculation, not of historical record, while Baal-Shunu was the governor in Syria, his business in Babylonia, now managed by his subordinates, went on in much the same way as before. Earlier, when he had been governor of Babylon, he had been the political subordinate of an Iranian provincial governor of Babylonia, of the province. Now, as governor in Syria, he may have been administratively independent, but he still cannot have been a social or a political equal of the governor of Babylonia, for his Babylonian assets were actually a hostage to his good behavior. If King Xerxes, or one of his successors, really had divided the old satrapy of Babylon and across the river into two parts, he did not really make the two parts fully independent. They were still bound together and therefore restrained not only by 50 years or more of joint administration, but also by the persons and the fortunes of the governors and the policies of the kings who appointed the governors. Paltry as these tablets may seem, I would argue that the Kasr texts and the Kasr archive were shaped not only by the relationships between local businesses and provincial government, but also by the relationships between the continental empire and by an antique, complex society bonded into the empire. The contents of the texts are usually too specific to betray these general conditions, but where the texts are extraordinary or anomalous, for example, in the remarkable career of Baal-Shunu, they are not just quaint or anecdotal. They can only be understood as the result of particular interplays among developing general structural conditions, for example, changes in the form of provincial government, and more or less long-term imperial policies, that is, the king's efforts to keep the provinces tied together, and also more or less urgent short-term political exigencies, that is, the need to settle succession crises and to face dissident princes like Cyrus the Younger. Before we all take the hint that's implied in this picture, let me close by returning to Claudius Rich, whom I mentioned earlier. Depicted here with his wife Mary Rich. Claudius died at 40, she died at 85. And his two memoirs, Claudius Rich's two memoirs on the site of Babylon. Consider for a moment the site, the climate in which these two works were produced. Rich's career in Baghdad took place during and immediately after the Napoleonic Wars. The European empires in Asia were young, and the great game was still in its infancy. Europeans in the Near East were beginning to look around them with new eyes, and they saw not only roads along which armies could move, ports that could serve growing imperial shipping and imperial navies, crops and minerals that could be exploited, princes who could be suborned, and societies that could be dominated, but they also saw the records of history and the relics of antiquity. These were men and women who knew the texts of Xenophon and Diodorus and Strabo and the other classical writers, and they were beginning to know the Muslim geographers. They could interpret what they were seeing in the light of what they had read. What they reported was an integrated view of the world they saw, a natural history, and that natural history included human history. And it was actually, believe it or not, at the forefront of science in its time, the focus of the greatest minds of the age. Goethe wrote on the Orient. Hooke wrote on hieroglyphs. Humboldt actually met and conversed with Claudius Rich and promised to come and visit him in Baghdad. Returned travelers in those days could dine out on their anecdotes of the East for years, and what they wrote was swallowed up as fast as it was published. Austin Henry Layard said that his books sold as well as cookbooks. When no less a poet than Byron, Lord Byron, wrote in Don Juan about some infidels who don't, because they can't find out the spot of that same Babel, or because they won't, though Claudius Rich Esquire some bricks has got, and written lately 2 memoirs upon it. When he wrote those lines, Byron could assume that his audience, not, I remind you, the audience of some arid windbag of a professor, but the audience of Byron, that his audience already knew who Rich was and what the memoirs that he had written were. I very much doubt that any modern archaeologist or Assyriologist could achieve that kind of celebrity today. But it's worth recollecting that when these fields of study were born, they were not in any sense esoteric. At a time when literature and exploration and science were part of the same fabric of knowledge, these antiquities were part of the way in which reasonable men and women advanced their understanding of the world, and I trust that they still are. Thank you for your attention. It's, I think, incumbent on me to ask you if you would like to ask questions or if you would prefer to follow the hint that I pointed out in that slide and adjourn for refreshments and perhaps put questions there. In that case, let me lead the way.